Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. Clean Energy BC is pleased this afternoon to welcome you to this webinar, which is Connecting BC's energy and climate policy on the path to net zero. We've seen a lot of activities, particularly around COP26, and many of those involve Canadian and British Columbia policies and municipal policies as well that affect the renewable energy industry. So we thought this would be a good time post COP26 to have some industry experts give us their views on what's happening at a broader level, and then also in terms of British Columbia. So we have as our moderator for this webinar, we have Markham Hislop. He's based on Vancouver Island and heads up Energy Media. I've put the website up there because you'll definitely want to go and visit it. It's a very rich source of information with interviews with leading experts from around the world. And so we're very happy to have Markham facilitating this webinar for us because he brings so much knowledge. We also have Dan Vinolovich, who heads up Polaris Strategy and Insight. It's a strategic advisory firm helping clients navigate the energy transition and find opportunities through climate solutions. With 2 decades of experience working at the intersections of energy and climate change and policy and politics, he is a seasoned analyst and advocate. His work remains mission-driven, and he supports a diverse group of clients, including business, governments, think tanks, civil society organizations, and philanthropic foundations. He also serves as the board chair of the recently launched BC Centre for Innovation in Clean Energy. Secondly, we have Cameron Letzig, who some of you may have seen before. Cam has been providing a lot of advisory services to Clean Energy BC and has many decades of experience in the electricity industry in particular. His company is called Keppelgate Consulting, which is based here in Vancouver. It's a consultancy specializing in energy and resource economics, public policy, regulation, policy development, and commercial negotiations. Keppelgate's clients include corporations, governments, and First Nations. And then third, we will have Tom-Pierre Frappé-Seneclaz. I knew I would stumble on that, my apologies, who is the Director of Buildings and Urban Solutions with the Pembina Institute. Tom is the Director for Urban Solutions at the Pembina Institute, which is, pardon me, Canada's leading clean energy think tank. Through fact-finding, convening, and coalition building, he facilitates the development and implementation of policies to reduce carbon pollution and energy waste from homes and buildings. Tom-Pierre has a long list of consulting services that he's provided to governments such as the City of Vancouver, Dawson Creek, the town of Faro in the Yukon, and the Sawtoo Renewable Resource Board. He sits on the Resource Planning and Demand Side Management Advisory Bodies for BC Hydro and Fortis BC, on the City of Vancouver Green Building Advisory Committee, and on BC's Stretch Code Working Group. So I'll turn this over to Markham. I just want for housekeeping to let you know that Markham is going to be posing some questions to the 3 panelists. And once that has wrapped, we will open up to questions and answers. We ask you to use the Q&A button to pose your questions, and we will be posing those questions to the panelists once they've finished talking. Thanks, and I'll turn it over to Markham now.
Thank you, Lorraine, and welcome everybody to the webinar. Before I get started, I'd like to acknowledge that Energy Media is located on the unceded territory of the Qualicum First Nation, And now how the panel is going to work is that each one of the panelists has submitted 3 topics that they would like to address. So I'm going to go around the panel. I'll ask the first question. We'll allow the other 2 panelists to respond. We'll have some discussion after that, and each one of the conversations will be 5 to 7 minutes, and then we'll move on to the next topic. So the first one is for Cam, and Cam, BC Hydro's integrated resource plan and the CleanBC and GHG reduction goals don't appear to line up. What are the areas between the IRP and the CleanBC that need to be connected?
Oh, Cam, you're muted there.
Didn't know I did that. I'm sorry. Thanks, Markham. I think there's a couple of perspectives on this question. So the first is the question of whether or not the IRP and the CleanBC plan line up technically. The question of whether or not what's in the plan is likely to achieve the GHG targets and other targets that are expected from CleanBC. And I think there's a range of reasonable debate there about whether it's on the right path, it's directionally correct, whether it's a mid-stop on that path. And I think that there's a credible argument it's good but not far enough, given the expectations of the CleanBC plan. I think a second question is whether or not the IRP is even the right framework for asking these questions, whether or not it's appropriate to be looking at a utility planning document, which for practical purposes is a plan by the utility to meet the service of its existing and potentially future customers, and whether or not that, in the context of a hearing before the Utilities Commission with its own circumscribed mandate, is the right place to be making policy debate, policy discussions. And I think in the absence of some broader public policy and specific recommendations and policies out of the government, what we've seen is the IRP standing in as a proxy for a proxy forum for that policy debate. And I think that that's put an unreasonable expectation or an inappropriate expectation on the IRP. And so where I see the gap most fundamentally is that we're trying to answer a policy question with a utility planning document with the inevitable consequences of that.
Okay, Tom Pierre, would you like to respond, please?
Thanks, Mark. I would agree on the latter point. I think one of the technical aspects, like the IRP includes a range of contingency scenario, including two accelerated electrification scenarios that are, have been tailored to represent the electrical load that we expect to see if BC was to meet its climate target. So energy economy model to drive a projection of what the load would be, and then BC Hydro takes that load and say, okay, how will we meet that load essentially? So it's in the plan. It's not the base plan, which in terms of public communication is a bit of a challenge. And I think Cam was alluding to this, like what's the role of the utility in there? The part that we don't know yet is in the way in which the short-term actions, because the short-term actions were not included in the draft RRP. And these are what matters. This is what BC Hydro will actually do between now and the next time they do an RRP, right? So in the next 5 years, what are they going to do? So to what degree these short-term actions are coherent with these, with the base case, of course, by definition, but with these contingency scenarios that are aligned with the climate target. That's a big question that we still need to see. I've got reasonable hope that it will be, which just remains a question of where, what we need in terms of policy signals from the province to make it clear to BC Hydro and others that we're now operating in that contingency space.
Dan, if you could respond, please.
Yeah, I think I would echo those comments, and particularly Cameron's comment, about ending up in a situation where we are using a regulatory process as a proxy for policy debates, in part because we have a lack of policy clarity coming from government. And I think this this is a perennial issue, and I think one that ultimately, government is going to need to address. I think with the recently released CleanBC roadmap to 2030, we do now have some additional policy clarity in terms of new, more stringent targets for zero emission vehicle sales, a cap on natural gas utilities emissions. So we have some more of that clarity now. I think one of the challenges we have right now is that we've become a little bit cross-threaded in terms of the timelines. And so, at the same time that the government was developing the roadmap to 2030 for CleanBC, BC Hydro was working on the draft IRP using the 2018 version of CleanBC. And so by the time the draft IRP came out, within a matter of weeks, it was rendered obsolete by the fact that now we have this roadmap to 2030. So I think there is a need for better alignment between BC Hydro and the government in terms of making sure that we do have a plan that doesn't become immediately obsolete, and also that the plan has adequate transparency in terms of its assumptions. And I think this is where, when we get into the differentiation between an accelerated scenario versus the base scenario, the level of detail and the focus of much of the public discussion tends to center around that base scenario. So I think being in a situation where perhaps a contingency scenario is actually our real scenario, I think that's problematic.
Okay, I have a question that comes from your comment, Dan, about transparency. And that is, if the integrated resource plan modeling and scenario building is integral to the BC roadmap, is there enough transparency in that modeling? Do we have the assumptions? Do we have that information so that it can be analyzed and critiqued?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a policy wonk and an analyst, and so I like having as many details and as much transparency as possible. And I would say right now, both BC Hydro and the provincial government fall short in terms of making publicly available the modeling that they do and the assumptions that underpin it, so that other stakeholders can have a kick at it in terms of testing the credibility of some of those assumptions or the approach to modeling. So I think that's, again, something that we need to have both government and BC Hydro working on, and hopefully having the BC Utilities Commission requesting that as well, and ensuring that more of that comes out, and not just by way of back and forth questions and answers in the regulatory process, but in terms of the actual documents that are prepared and made publicly available.
Cam and Tom Pierre, we're running a little bit behind in time. If you could briefly jump in with a response, please.
Yeah, I agree with the absence of detailed data. I'll point to one specific example. I think the fact of BC Hydro having a surplus, which underpins a whole bunch of its policy initiatives, including its electrification plan, is something that has been accepted as received wisdom, but I've not seen a lot of support for that, or the length of time the dates appear to move. And I think we would all benefit from fully understanding the extent to which forecast or future DSM is a component of that assumed surplus.
Tom Pierre?
I mean, no analyst will ever tell you, no, we need less data. Of course, we're allowed to see the data. I do think we need to be a bit careful with energy models, is that they take a fair amount of literacy to understand, because there's a lot of simulate. We're going to model this by pretending it's going to look like this, but really we know it's not going to be this. And they're shorthands. And so in terms of public communication, it can be challenging to release economy models, because they can easily be misconstrued about, this is what really you're planning, and this is really what you think. So there's a middle ground there, but I do agree that there's not quite the transparency of data that we need to do due diligence on whether this is solid or not.
Well, Tom Pierre, I'm going to ask you the next question, and CleanBC is a game changer to gas utilities, such as banning incentives for furnaces and boilers and setting a cap on the emissions of the utility. How, if it's amended properly, will it radically change how FBC needs to operate?
So for this BC, and there's a lot of questions mark around there, right? So the key new piece that was brought by CleanBC, the latest version, Dan alluded to it, is now the gas utilities are going to have an emission cap, and that's a first in Canada and maybe in North America and maybe in the world. Like the utility itself is going to need to reduce its emission. It's going to change a lot the kind of programming they can offer, including like whether they will be able to continue to like pretty aggressively pursue new construction being connected to gas, because all of the buildings are currently connected to that gas. New connections, which is one of the key business driver for a utility, will increase their carbon liability that you need to reduce otherwise. The ramification of this in terms of electrification is, of course, like the electrical load in BC and what the future uptake of electrification program by BC Hydro and the government will be depends a lot on that relative dynamic of how much are we continuing to rely on gas for heating our buildings and how much of that is moving to electricity. So we do have two big pieces that are changing right now, with BC Hydro actually now proactively marketing electrification in terms of public communication. That's a huge shift. I'm not sure we're quite seeing the kind of fiscal heft that we need to see from BC Hydro to see the level of electrification we need to meet targets. But with FortisBC now in the future having a cap, that's going to also change a lot the landscape of how much electricity we're going to need. And therefore, like where we sit in that landscape that the RP explored in terms of, we might very well be now in that contingency scenario and need to treat it less like a contingency and more like a base case.
Dan, do you want to respond, please?
Yeah, I agree with the points Tom raised. I think there's going to be this tension now that exists within the system in terms of having more clarity around policy on both the electrification side and then as it relates to a gas utility's emissions. But we don't actually have a system that's built to respond to that. We have resource planning that happens for gas utilities. We have resource planning that happens for electric utilities, and there isn't any kind of a process in place where those two are actually reconciled. They're dealt with by the BCUC as one-offs. And so if we look to some other jurisdictions, they're actually requiring gas utilities and electricity utilities to work together to develop a plan that spans both the gas system and the electricity system, or sometimes it's the utility regulator itself would take these separate plans and merge them into one coherent plan. And so that's something that I think CleanBC is really kind of forcing that question and ultimately an answer to that question about how to ensure that for a regulator that is tasked with making sure we've got reliable and affordable energy in the province, how are we making sure that we're optimizing both of those systems to achieve those outcomes?
Cam, if you'd like to respond, please.
Yeah, I think certainly the one of the problems with the GHG goals British Columbia's had for a while has been a lack of specific mandate by sector, industry, or any other delineation, and that's created a lot of sort of finger pointing, but no particular requirement by anybody to take specific actions. And I think this could go some distance there. Clearly, you worry about applying it specifically to one sector and not others, and what the allocative effects of that are. Another question, of course, is how it's applied. I presume that the underlying intention is the gas-electric substitution, and you worry about whether or not the strength of the signal is going to be adequate to achieve that result at a level that is politically tolerable. And then the question that I would have beyond that is, if that is the intention, it's clearly got poverty implications for low-income people who are probably less able to make some of the transitional expectations that are underpinning the policy. And so, a fuller policy discussion would include questions about how that protection of low-income customers is going to be looked after.
Well, I have a question for the panel, and that is, if electricity and gas are treated separately but need to be treated as an integrated whole, well, it's not. The BC government has said that it wants to move aggressively into hydrogen production. Does that mean that we need a third planning process, or is this the opportunity to build that agency that can integrate all of this together? Why don't we start with Tom Pierre?
I think, I think when you remember that we're in a province of 4 million people, and that like our capacity to create new agencies and new systems and administration, even though like that would be my dream to, hey, like to have a central intelligence that tackle all of this, we still have limited like resources in terms of public dollar. No, like the utilities, we do have significant buffer in the fact that we have a really low energy costs, and partially like to address some the point that Cam's made around energy poverty, like we can redistribute a lot of that cost while still keeping very affordable energy and making sure that low income people have like real support to, you know, avoid energy poverty. And that would, you know, still make energy not a huge factor for most middle income, upper middle income and beyond in energy bills. So we have leeway, which, you know, we could leverage some of that leeway also to create some of that infrastructure. But I do think there's a lot in infrastructure that we have already that we can make work better to achieve these outcomes.
Cam, if you could respond, please.
Yeah, I perhaps more than some, I'm somewhat suspicious of the role that a new entity or the efficacy of a new entity in the province. I'm not sure we have an entity problem so much as we have an ability to organize ourselves. And I think that there's plenty of room for within the existing framework to ask ourselves questions about whether or not something like a shift to hydrogen or other things are an interesting idea. I think we need to think about how we're having conversations and not before we think about adding new entities to the conversation.
Dan, if you could respond, please.
Yeah, I would agree with that point insofar as I think we need to see the evolution of institutions as opposed to the addition of institutions. I think if we look at whether we're talking about government departments and divisions or the BC Utilities Commission, you know, these were designed and built in the 20th century. We haven't yet revisited that and said, do we have them structured in the right way, necessarily with the right mandates, with the right skill sets? Are they asking the right questions? So I think there is a need precipitated by, you know, obviously the objectives we have from a climate perspective, but also considering the economy, considering matters of equity, reconciliation, to actually go through and look at these institutions and say, how do they need to evolve and change? Doesn't necessarily require new resources, but perhaps a reallocation of some resources.
Okay, I'm going to move on to the third question now. We're running a little short of time. So Dan, this one's for you. BC Hydro Planning, the IRP and the Electrification Plan, and the CleanBC Roadmap to 2030 don't line up. What are the disconnects?
I think the one that was really laid bare with the release of the CleanBC Roadmap to 2030 is around what we're expecting from our transportation sector in terms of emission reductions and the role that electricity is going to play in that. And so with the integrated resource plan, it is only in draft, but then BC Hydro has also filed their RRA, which is where the electrification plan is included. And that electrification plan was informed by the government's previous targets for electric vehicle sales out into the future. And so that's one of the most significant changes we saw with the roadmap. Whereas previously the sales targets for personal electric vehicles that are regulated were 10% of sales in 2025 and 30% of sales in 2030 and 100% by 2040. Those have all been dramatically accelerated. Now we're looking at 26% of sales in 2026, 90% of sales in 2030, and 100% of sales in 2035. Layered onto that, there are going to be similar regulations for medium and heavy duty vehicles as well. So the extent to which we are going to have a significant increase in the number of electric vehicles on the roads as a result of the roadmap, that's not reflected in the electrification plan that's currently before the BCUC. And that's going to have significant impacts, obviously in terms of load, but also in terms of how to think about where we need charging, when we need charging, how to use rates to inform when charging happens. So I think that's a disconnect that is absolutely going to need to be remedied.
Cam, if you could respond, please.
Yeah, I strongly agree with Dan's observation that the pace of electric vehicles is going to be quicker than people expected. I think that's partly driven by the policy. I think it's partly driven by what's going to be a fairly sudden change in personal tastes. And I think that hasn't been adequate planning for that. But more broadly, the disconnections that at least trouble me between the CleanBC roadmap and the IRP are some of the things that aren't in there that I think need to be because they're strongly implicated. And those are things, some of the social questions. How does reconciliation, First Nations reconciliation, fit in economic opportunity for First Nations? How does, as I mentioned earlier, the protection of low-income individuals? It's certainly fine to say that new cars need to be purchased in a particular category, but there's a large percentage of British Columbians who aren't in the new car market. And if there's a punitive element on the other side, that's a very serious concern. And then there's an industrial question. What is the industrial policy of the province to achieve some of these things? How is it going to affect communities where employment is scarce and regional development? And those sorts of things ought to be part of the questions that are being implicated by the roadmap and by the IRP. And I just haven't seen adequate attention paid to them.
Tom Pierre, if you could respond, please.
I'll just pick up again on the transportation. I think that's a good example of what we were talking about earlier, which is like, what are some of those policy road sign that the government needs, that BC Hydro felt they didn't have enough clarity on to consider the electrification scenario as the base case. And I think we're starting to see some of those land in, and it'll be interesting to see how much the next version of the final version of the IRP we see will have incorporated that and reflected that. And if there's no, BC Hydro has a deadline, to submit that final RP by December. If there was not enough time to integrate that, I think there should be a request for a delay and make sure that we see those, those new targets on electrification of transportation, including on buildings. I think the policies that have been announced on natural gas will also accelerate electrification of the building. So we're seeing those signals that we're in the contingency scenario more than the base case right now. And both in the narrative of the RRP and in the short-term action, I think hopefully we'll see that change. Yeah.
Dan, this is a follow-up question for you. The disconnects need to be remedied, but the fact that they occurred in the first place is symptomatic of other issues that need to be resolved. What are those issues?
Well, I think it's in part a lack of clear direction from the BC government to BC Hydro in terms of what its role is as it relates to CleanBC and emissions reductions. And so we have seen now in the roadmap to 2030, the government has indicated that they are going to more explicitly mandate BC Hydro with a role in terms of electrification and reducing emissions. That has been lacking. And so considering it's, certainly when I talk to people elsewhere in Canada and they look at BC, they say, okay, the fact that you have a Crown corporation as your utility, that offers the government some advantage in terms of trying to have electrification happening as a key lever for decarbonizing. And I think we really haven't necessarily seen that come to pass here in BC, where we have these examples of a disconnect between what BC Hydro is planning for versus what the government is indicating it wants to achieve in terms of emission reductions. And this is important in terms of how it plays out in the public debate and the political debate. So when the draft IRP came out and their headline saying we've got enough power to get us through 2030, I mean, that was predicated on a base scenario that sees BC fail to hit its legislated emission reduction targets. And so to the extent that British Columbians are a little bit confused as to what's going on, I think that's understandable. And I actually think that's quite risky from a political perspective, because then all of a sudden the narrative is going to change, that we're short on power, that we need power. What are we going to do? So I think that making sure that BC Hydro does have a clear mandate and therefore is able to deliver planning that aligns with what the government is trying to achieve, and that the public can be brought along with that is critically important.
Cam and Tom Pierre, if you can comment.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. I mean, to me, when the government wants to speak clearly, like on Site C, it appears to be quite comfortable with how to do that. It tells BC Hydro to build the dam and it clears the Utilities Commission out of the way. And when it wants to do other things, it seems to speak in code. It issues the BC's electricity objectives in the Clean Energy Act. It does these sorts of things. It talks about expanding mandates in imprecise ways. I think it needs to be, the government needs to step forward and be quite precise about how it feels about its GHG targets and the commitments it's prepared to make and what the social ramifications are. I think the time has passed for the sort of pushing the mandate out to the commission and let them make a decision, pushing the mandate out to BC Hydro. There's one policy setting body in this province that should be describing the transitional changes that need to be made. And I just feel that until it does so in clear language, like it did with Site C, it's going to be very difficult for the other entities to navigate that.
We're a bit of a boring panel because we agree too much. There's a few, on the flip side, I would say like there's a lot more clarity with this version of CleanBC. There's still a lot of data, nitty-gritty policies that need to be, regulations that need to be written, including some some direction to the utilities and to the utility commission around, like right now we're gonna ask the utility commission to balance greenhouse gas regulations, First Nation reconciliation, protecting low-income British Columbians, and kind of keeping rate lows, acknowledging that there's a very strong correlation between keeping the rates low and the capacity of electricity to compete against other fossil fuels, right? So how does the utility commission balance these four objectives? Like there's a real trade-off between those. They won't always ask for the same thing. And so there's going to be a question there, and it's going to require government to step in and give that direction in their policies. We can't let the commission decide which of these are primordial and when, what sort of trade-offs do we consider acceptable, because that's a political choice and we need our politicians to make that choice. They've made a lot of choices in CleanBC, which are going to set a lot of these things in motion. And it's going to be interesting to see now, like how BC Hydro, and like I tip my hat to the folks at BC Hydro. Part of that disconnect is also just a question of timing, right? The RP needed to proceed in the time that it had ahead of CleanBC. They've built a lot of capacity to adapt to this changing landscape through these contingency scenarios. That was a great exercise. Now we're going to need to see, if the draft RP lands on its feet in the final and really integrates the direction given by CleanBC.
Okay, this is a second question for Cam. How does the abandonment by BC Hydro of the independent power production sector, how's that affecting BC's First Nation reconciliation goals?
Well, I think it's taken off the table a very important tool for reconciliation. There are very few sectors of this province where there's room for rural First Nations to have substantial economic opportunity, and energy development was one of them. And that was a very important tool. And it's been eroded in a very fundamental way. And it's true that Hydro has said they'll continue to contract with that, but everything they're saying about that is in a very monopsonist rent extraction sort of way. We'll take the benefits out of the recontracting and for the benefit of ratepayers. And I think that's very dangerous. I think the other thing is that the focus on BC Hydro's responsibility to reconciliation has been very much around letting contracts for IPP development. I think there's a great many other ways they could do it. They have vast flexibility in the storage hydro system that could be used to integrate clean resources to the benefits of First Nations. They have a very flexible transmission system that could be used. There's a whole range of ways in which BC Hydro could be an instrument of reconciliation. And I haven't seen a very strong direction in that, or a very strong emphasis on it in either the IRP or the CleanBC plan. And I think that's contrary to their own stated goals for both the province and BC Hydro, but it's also a foregone opportunity that is just very fundamental to the opportunities for First Nations in this province.
Dan, can you respond, please? Dan, your mic is muted. It seems that Dan has got some technical problems. Tom Pierre, can you respond, please?
Yeah, I'll check in. I agree with Cam to a large extent. I think there's also some internal conversation with BC Hydro that would require the government to weigh in again on those trade-offs. Like, what's the role of IPPs versus BC Hydro developed resources, and what's the role of partnership with First Nation in there? I think there's a broad range also of partnership with First Nations, and I think there needs to be, multi-PP projects in BC have some sort of partnership. I do think there needs to be differentiation between them. I think we also want to make sure that those high PP First Nation relationship maximize the value to the communities, maximize, economic opportunity, job opportunities, control opportunities, ownership opportunities, equity. So there's a range there that we need to acknowledge. And I think we need to be explicit around this is where we believe that there's a reconciliation benefit that justifies, even if it's in theory maybe more expensive than other power, which is not always certain. But if there is to be a trade-off between cost payer rate and First Nation reconciliation, that's a political choice. And I believe that we can identify those and make those choices. I think it needs to be transparent.
Dan, if you could respond, please.
Sure. I think this is a real sleeper issue that we haven't seen much public or political consideration of. Certainly, I've heard from numerous First Nations that have an interest in, and many have actually received funding from the provincial government to conduct studies looking at what their clean energy generation opportunities are in their territories. And yet now they're hearing that, well, no, we're not actually going to create a situation for you to capitalize on this opportunity. And there's a lot of frustration around that, especially recognizing the extent to which it's a means of economic reconciliation. We're going to need more clean electricity in the province to achieve our greenhouse gas emission reduction objectives. So, I think there's a disconnect there, and we're seeing it play out right now as it relates to forestry. But I think, looking ahead to 2022, I would be surprised if we didn't see this emerge as more of a tension point between First Nations and government in terms of what does reconciliation look like. And to Tom Pierre's point, we make decisions all the time in terms of imposing additional costs. We've certainly done that when it comes to putting a price on carbon pollution with a carbon tax, which that makes my natural gas bill more expensive. And so I think to treat the opportunity for Indigenous economic development as a cost that perhaps we're not willing to bear, I think that really does run counter to the principles of the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People and the act that the provincial government passed to that effect.
Okay, next question is for Tom Pierre. This is your second question. Tell us about the importance of developing BC renewable natural gas resources rather than relying on continental markets.
Yeah, that's interesting. So that connects back to, why is this relevant to this specific audience? Comes back to the question of what's the role of natural gas and electricity competition in the market, and what's that's going to do to the demand for clean electricity and the capacity to switch to fossil fuels, away from fossil fuels in BC, but also continentally. So right now we have a mandate to source energy from within BC, still, and hopefully for foreseeable future. There's a role for market trading in terms of planning purposes. Can talk more about this, but there is still, I think, a strong political buy-in and public buy-in to have. We have lots of resources in BC. We should use this. I think the same thing needs to apply to renewable natural gas. We have lots of opportunity to do economic development in BC when it comes to sources for renewable natural gas. The corollary there is that renewable gas might end up being more expensive than if we just source it to the cheapest bidder anywhere in the North American grid. And when we say North American grid, obviously it's not the molecule of methane from a renewable natural gas project in Texas that make it here. They're just kind of credits essentially, right? So from an affordability perspective, we could quote unquote meet our climate targets by buying renewable natural gas in other places. But then we totally miss on the economic opportunity. And also we potentially, by being first mover, it gives us an affordability advantage. but it's not a continental solution in terms of climate. We will need this renewable natural gas everywhere, including, and when we're talking about Canada's wide, a third to a quarter of our natural gas in Canada is used in the oil sands to generate gasoline and other petroleum products. Given that there's not a plan at this point to phase out by 2050 the oil sands, there's the conversation of a cap. We're still going to need a lot of natural gas there. And in practice, we're going to need a lot of renewable natural gas to be used there in order to decarbonize that sector. So we need to really rely primarily on the renewable natural gas that is within BC, both from an economic development perspective, but also from a kind of climate equity and climate realism perspective.
Cam, if you could respond, please.
Yeah, well, I don't have much to add on the subject of renewable natural gas specifically. It's not my area of expertise. I'd only say that picking up on Tom Bier's observation that at some level these things distill to looking a lot like carbon credits, and well, that's a subject that's ripe for lots of discussion and debate. I do concern myself with the idea about whether or not how we want to make the trade-off between low cost and economic or industrial opportunity. And I think that I would be a lot more comforted about the conversation around renewable natural gas if I saw a forum for those sorts of conversations to be taking place, so that there was a more clear and broad-based discussion about the value of renewable natural gas within the context of BC's industrial and climate plan.
Dan?
I guess the point I would like to make is that let's not just think about renewable natural gas, so biomethane, but renewable gases more broadly, which then includes hydrogen. And again, so we have this hydrogen strategy, which is not well integrated with BC Hydro's IRP. Doesn't mention prospects for green hydrogen production and what kind of load might develop by virtue of that production, and that has both applications domestically here in British Columbia for industrial purposes, can be blended into the natural gas system, but also thinking of the fact that we've got ports here in British Columbia as a coastal province. And if we look at what's happening with the evolution of the shipping industry as it relates to decarbonization, where they're looking at shifting to likely to ammonia and the prospects of producing green ammonia, which has hydrogen as a component of it, it feels to me as though there's extensive opportunity here. We're kind of dealing with it in a fragmented way, where we might just be talking about renewable natural gas as it relates to the cap on gas utilities emissions. We're thinking about it in a bigger picture way and connecting all the dots, including to what is the economic opportunity for British Columbia, but to Cameron's point in terms of cost, in which areas do we actually have some comparative advantage where we can actually truly compete and succeed economically?
Dan, this is your second question, and there is no energy plan connecting CleanBC to broader industrial policy, including economic recovery. Your thoughts on that, please?
Yeah, so if we go back in history a few years, in 2017, when the NDP came to power here in Victoria, the energy minister at the time, as part of her mandate letter, there was a directive to develop an energy roadmap for the province. And of course, the environment minister had a directive to develop a climate plan. And in the process of developing the climate plan, the energy roadmap fell by the wayside. And consequently, by the time CleanBC, the climate plan, came out in 2018, essentially we were told, well, the energy roadmap is de facto kind of embedded within the climate plan. But if you look at the CleanBC plan, or even the roadmap to 2030 that was released this year, it certainly isn't an energy plan or an energy strategy in terms of how we might look at other jurisdictions that have energy plans that really look at both the production side and the consumption side across liquid fuels, the gas system, electricity. And I think in BC, given the extent to which we both consume energy and we also export energy, whether it's natural gas, whether it's electrons, I think we really are lacking in terms of not having a clear energy plan for the province, and one that is designed to be completely consistent with CleanBC and our climate objectives, but really does look at the evolution of our energy system and the energy systems that we trade into.
Tom Pierre, if you could respond, please.
Certainly agree. And I mean, typically we look at it in terms of the risk, like, you know, the carbon liability that our LNG export would present, right? Like, so if we grow our LNG export even more, which is always kind of out there as a possibility, it's going to make it, you know, there's no wiggle room here in our carbon budget to accommodate that. And that's not been articulated explicitly. So there's just, from a climate perspective, there's a liability there. But on the other side of the ledger, there's tons of opportunities, you know, like back to the hydrogen question. Yeah, what if BC was to be a clean, green exporter of hydrogen? What would that look like? So there's a lot on the economic development opportunity that we've not, you know, we've got some pieces, but we don't have an integrated picture. And obviously there's a balance between the two in our role as, you know, an energy exporter, including the question of, you know, and here we shouldn't leave the federal government off the hook. The whole conversation of interties between provinces would import, like would generate a lot more capacity for BC to export clean power to Alberta. And there's also, you know, Cascadia integration. We could grow our capacity to exports to the US and maybe, you know, balance some of the solar load all the way to California, right? Our different peaking systems. So there's a lot that we can do to increase our economic development opportunities in the clean energy realm.
Cam, if you could respond.
Yeah, I think that, you know, one of the keys to an effective industrial strategy is that governments creates a sound foundation for long-term investment, and that includes providing the basis for a stable understanding of in this context, energy pricing, energy availability, energy security, the time to construct the infrastructure that's required to support the industry. And I haven't felt that there's been a lot of focus on providing that stability. There's a lot of what I'll think of as hanging policies, things like the GHGs without GHG requirements or expectations without necessarily a clear articulation of the policies, things like asserting surplus electricity, but having ongoing transmission constraints with uncertain understanding about the timing to remediate those things. I think they all create a degree of uncertainty in the industrial space, and that makes it difficult for industry to plan and understand the cost and regulatory structure when they operate in British Columbia. I think with very low commitment and cost, there's an opportunity to make vast improvement there and to really provide a much more stable platform for industry to make choices about locating in British Columbia. I think as we flip between LNG and now I see in the IRP, it's going to be data centers and cryptocurrency. We've had mining rates in the province. We have oil and gas electrification expectations with limited commitment. I think these types of things don't create that type of stable base that industry is looking for. And I think British Columbia could pick up its game quite easily there and make progress that would provide much more stability and opportunity.
Now we've got 9 minutes until the top of the hour, and we have time for one question for sure, but if we're efficient, maybe we can squeeze in a second one. So Cam, this is your third question. The disconnect between the cost of the policy aims and the extent to which they are financed through BC Hydro's rates, which are not designed to bear costs beyond those that are legislated. Your explanation, please.
Yeah, so when BC Hydro decides it wants to undertake a degree of undertake some costs, and they are under pressure to do those in response to public policy, there's always a question about what their ability to do that is and what the ability of the BC Utilities Commission to approve that. But I think, again, we have a case where we're trying to shove public policy that's motivated by broad social aims into rates and into this regulatory and affordability constraints of those rates. And I think it's proper and it would be beneficial to British Columbia to step back and ask itself, what is the appropriate way to think about who should bear and how should they bear the cost of these sorts of things? I think that would make reconciliation, certain environmental objectives, poverty protection. Those would make those things less eccentric issues in a regulatory forum and more core issues in a public policy forum where they belong.
Tom Pierre, if you could respond.
Yeah, I agree. I think for the sake of time, I'll leave it at that for now.
Okay. Dan, do you have any comments?
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I think it's a completely reasonable point in terms of what should we decide through a regulatory process versus what should we decide through an election. And I think when we're talking about some of these issues, which are very much broad social and political issues, then I think the ballot box is probably the right place to make those decisions. And then I think that then can decide, what do we use taxpayer dollars for versus what do we try to achieve with ratepayer dollars.
Okay. Tom Pierre, this is going to be your third question. How can local governments take early leadership, and how can we coordinate market transformation ahead of that?
So when we're talking about the electrification plan for BC, whether it's local government, like whether it's transportation and buildings, there's different capacities to bear the political costs of action, right? And both in terms of just administration, like number of civil servants that we have to do the work of policy design, and then the political risk. There's a tradition in BC to give a lot of power to local governments. This has been, made very visible in terms of building codes, for example. Like they have the energy step code that allows local governments to ask more than the base code. And most, about 75% of construction in BC now is covered under energy step code that goes beyond the base code, motivated by climate, energy, and frankly, equity objectives of governments. So the same question continues for the rest of the electrification pathways. Is like, where is the role of local governments in this leadership? And when, does the province need to act first? So for example, in the rest of the electrification pathway for buildings, the current approach in CleanBC is mostly through regulation of equipment, right? The government is planning to say you can no longer sell a gas furnace or a gas boiler by 2030. When you go to the shelf, is it going to be baseboard or heat pumps, essentially? That's great, that's 2030, but and the province can bring it, some of those components can be regulated earlier, but they can't move much earlier than this because there's a pretty broad range of capacities within the province. But if you're talking about the Lower Mainland or even Capital Region, the markets are going to be ready way before that. So how do we give tools to the regions that have the capacity to move faster to do this, when the primary driver right now that we're looking at for decarbonizing all of our existing buildings is the regulation of equipment? Obviously, you can't have, the city of Vancouver say like, well, you can no longer buy a gas furnace in Vancouver because, somebody can just go and buy it in Burnaby. So there's a different approach to the regulation of existing buildings that need to enable local governments to take leadership where they can. And we haven't quite designed this. And that's going to have a big impact on like the pace at which we can do electrification.
Dan, if you could respond, please.
Yeah, I don't think I have a lot to add to that. I agree. I mean, I think at the end of the day, we need to make sure that, for those municipalities that have the opportunity and the desire to do more faster, that they are enabled and empowered to do so. And I think that it's a conversation that we haven't really had in British Columbia for quite some time in terms of, what is the respective role of the provincial government and municipal governments? What's the nature of the relationship between them on climate? And so I think that's something that as part of the roadmap to 2030, we need to see that unfold. And municipalities have a key role to play. And so we need to make sure that we aren't holding some back from doing more. And I think, unfortunately, that's the case at times right now.
Cam, if you could respond, please.
Yeah, I agree with that. There's a very strong case for local decision making in a lot of these areas, and I think it's really important that municipalities are given that opportunity, and the allocation of tax room and the flow of money between the municipal and provincial governments. I think needs to be more flexible in some of these areas to permit a greater degree of local autonomy and choice in some of the building and built space decision making.
I have a quick follow-up question for the three of you before we get into the Q&A, and that is, since we're talking about communities and we're talking about local governments, what role is communities have, like community solar, community hydrogen, community, all sorts of other programs, economic development, microgrids, those sorts of things. I wonder, in a province that's dominated by such a, by a crown-owned utility, does that act as a limiting factor for communities that, for instance, want to partner with IPPs? Tom Pierre, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, I mean, we are seeing kind of a calculation from BC Hydro around like the cost of new resources that, and while the portfolio optimization that you would see in a planning exercise will consider other attributes, these other attributes are qualitative, and most of the optimization in terms of portfolio, this is again just in their planning exercise, not necessarily bind them to what they will go and procure after, but does not factor in a lot of other social benefits. So like we're obviously talking about like First Nation reconciliation opportunities and economic development opportunities. I think community solar has a similar quality there in terms of both capacity building, but also like, just democracy building, right? Like we are empowering people to understand their energy system in a way that's much more intimate than what we typically do. And that has tons of value for our entire conversations around energy and for, empowerment and but also, capacity to think about energy in a way that's a lot more sophisticated than what we often see. So I think there's huge value there, and we need to recognize that value and find a way to support community energy project, even if they come at a slightly higher price. And again, and each time I say this, part of me cringes because I know that we're still in competition between electricity and fossil fuels, right? And so if we want to have a rapid transition, we need to keep our electricity rate low. But we can also, balance that off by other measures that, create price signal for fossil fuels. Carbon pricing needs to continue to go up, and other policies that said, look, we're going to set a cap on your emissions. So we're starting to see those signals, and I think that is healthy. We need to have the other signal on the different source of energy. Where do we value? What do we value, and how do we allocate resources to that?
Cam, do you want to take a kick at this one?
Yeah, certainly the importance of local decision making and the increasing technological opportunity for local control and development of power systems is really important. I think particularly that First Nations communities have a strong energy sovereignty desire that is not being well respected in this province right now. I think there are a number of steps that could be taken at a relatively low cost in absolute terms that would provide First Nations communities with much more control and sovereignty over their energy systems and their energy choices. I think we've repeatedly heard, including in the Utilities Commission inquiry into First Nations utility regulation, that was something that's of prime importance to First Nations communities. The IPP sector, I think, provides a technological and support base for those sorts of things. And I think relatively minor public policy changes and relatively small expenditures could provide an enormous degree of energy sovereignty improvement to First Nations communities, and that we should do that.
Dan, if you'd like to respond, please.
I think the only thing I would add is to actually layer on, the notion of resilience in the face of a changing climate, and the benefits that distributed energy or more local control over energy can play. We obviously all benefit from being part of a big macro grid as well. But it strikes me as odd sometimes that at the provincial level, we talk about it's legislated that we have self-sufficiency, and yet communities are not necessarily empowered to achieve the same thing. And I think there's growing interest, especially as whether it's the rainstorms that are hitting BC right now or fires in the summers. I think there is more of an interest in communities about understanding their energy system, having some control over that. And so I think that there is a need to be enabling and supporting that.
We're going to go to Q&A now. And so, Jack, I'll ask the questions. That's if you're okay with that. This question is from Laura Sachs. In your view, what should citizens be asking of the government to align CleanBC and BC Hydro? And maybe we could start off with Cam, if you could answer, please.
Well, I think we've talked a lot about that today, but I think what we should ask the government to do is, however they come to the decisions that they choose to make, and I think there's a lot of scope for debate and discussion about how they should reach that when they reach that decision, they should speak with the same clarity as I think I mentioned earlier that they spoke with about Site C. We have a lot of arm waving policy in areas where perhaps the government has less comfort in the trade-offs between the costs and the benefits, and very clear policy in certain other areas. I think we understand how government should speak to BC Hydro and how it should speak to the Utilities Commission when it wants certain things to occur. And I think we should have the expectation that they will speak with that clarity when they assert that they have policy objectives, whether those are related to First Nations reconciliation, the environment, industrial policy, or anything else.
Dan, if you could go next.
Yeah, I don't actually think I have anything to add to that. I think that was very well answered.
Tom Pierre?
I mean, in the short term, we're going to have, the final RFP that's going to come. And I'm hoping that this conversation right now saying, making sure that the draft RFP is current with CleanBC. I actually think that the government did provide a lot more clarity to BC Hydro in the recent CleanBC towards what it wants to see. And I think we need now the RFP to reflect that back in its final form. If there's not enough time, I would say the government should tell BC Hydro, okay, if you need an extension, we'll give you an extension, but we want to see an RFP that reflects the direction we just gave you. I think there's things that we've discussed that are not quite are clearly articulated in CleanBC, which is, like the role of reconciliation in its direction to BC Hydro, the role of poverty reduction, and the role of community resilience or community democracy through community-based projects. Like these three core values, I think would gain to have a bit more direction from the province through CleanBC or through an energy strategy and be flagged to BC Hydro. These are priorities, and here's how we want you, either here's the target where we want you to meet, or here's how we want you to weigh that against other objectives. Because obviously, you can't just say to BC Hydro or the BCOC, we want all these things and go figure out how to balance them. There needs to be some metric that's like, we want it at that level. We want it in that way, or these are the trade-offs that we're willing to see.
Okay, I'm going to go on to the next question, which is from an anonymous attendee, and it's a bit too long for me to read entirely, so I'm going to try to summarize it. And so Site C, it looks like the levelized cost of energy is going to come in around $150 a megawatt hour. And IPP contracts could be renewed for about half of that. There are all sorts of benefits that flow from that to communities and First Nations. Yet the government insists that it's going to be buying, cheap solar, I think as the minister said, from California. And so I guess the overall argument is, why aren't we doing more generation in BC, including around IPPs? And the attendee has asked us to comment. So Tom Pierre, maybe you could go first.
Well, I see two different questions and two different questions in that question. Like one is, about the rate of renewal, like at what rate should the IPPs be renewed? Frankly, I'm all attendees here. I'm not going to like what I'm going to say, but I don't think the contract should be extended the way they were set up to begin with. If a significant portion of the infrastructure costs got absorbed, I think that should be recognized, and then we should look at what the costs need to be to maintain that infrastructure and build contracts on this perspective. Like we need to keep the jobs, we need to get the projects going. We don't necessarily need to create tons and tons of profits out of those projects. A reasonable profit margin, but I find it hard to believe that these projects require the same investment that's they urgently needed to be created. But if you can transparently make a case that they need, I think that's made to be, can be looked at. Separately, the question of hey, do we prefer to import electricity? In the RRP right now, electricity import are used mostly as a temporary buffer for planning purposes, which is like when they're looking at contingency scenarios, like if we don't know yet if we're in world A or world B, we can defer, going and procure projects right now. If we assume that for a few years until we figure out if we're in world A and world B, we'll be fine relying on the market. To me, that's a proper use of market. If we're not sure yet how big our load's going to be, and we know that, in for a few years, we might be able to rely on market as we figure that out, I think that's fine. What we don't want to see is long extended period of requirement on market. And therefore we also need clear signals on how we know if we're in world A and world B. And in this case, particularly if we're in an accelerated electrification scenario that's compatible with climate, or if we're in the base case scenario of BC Hydro. That's one of those big trade-offs that we need to see soon.
Cam, if you could respond, please.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of sort of talking past each other in this debate, which frankly this government has supported the discussion of, and Hydro has continued to support the discussion of. There's not a direct comparison between what the Hydro refers to as the market price or the mid-C price, which is a short-term market that clears in a very different way than what is necessary to support the long-term contracting requirements of a new project, or the renewal contracting of an existing project. And we should have a clear discussion about what the different implications are from an economic point of view and what the true comparison points are. And then we should put that in the context of our public policy choices, including self-sufficiency, and make some informed decisions. There's a lot of comparison between the prices of Site C and IPPs, which isn't appropriate because of the way in which risk has been reallocated under BC Hydro's procurement theory, and between IPP prices and the spot market. None of those comparisons are terribly useful in the abstract, and given the dollar value of this debate, I don't think it's unreasonable to have those in a more informed way. And I think there's unlike many of the things we've discussed today, there is a good forum for this through the regulatory process. And I think it would be encouraging if the Utilities Commission forced that conversation to take place in a more robust way than it's happened so far.
Dan, if you could respond, please.
Yeah, I think 2 points to make. One, as it relates to the prospects for bringing electrons into BC from elsewhere. We often hear that's possible, as though we can just do it, and yet when I look at our certainly down Cascadia corridor, there are a lot of people who are beating the electrify everything drum, and so I don't think we have good line of sight in terms of what's going to happen on electricity supply and electricity demand and electricity prices in those neighboring jurisdictions, and therefore what implication that might have in terms of the cost of power that we might be bringing into BC. I think there's a lot of uncertainty associated with that, and I don't think we've really seen BC Hydro or PowerX or the BCUC or the government really exploring that, at least not in a public sense. So I think that's an important thing to bear in mind as well right now. The second point, as it relates to renewals, I agree with Tom Pierre that there needs to be, I think, a fair process to determine what a fair price would be. But I also think we also need to be cognizant of the broader signal that can be sent in terms of, BC is trying to attract all kinds of investment into the province, including for decarbonization. And I think to perhaps not renew those contracts, that the signal that would send in terms of whether or not BC is a jurisdiction that can offer certainty for these types of larger investments, I think could risk being very detrimental, and therefore create challenges in terms of attracting some of the additional investment capital we need for other climate solutions in the province.
I have a small contribution to make to this discussion. When the minister made his comment about buying cheap solar from California, I decided to test that argument as a journalist. So I interviewed a number of U.S. experts, including Elliot Mainzer, who's now the head of CASIO, Ben Kuyala, who's the power planner for the Pacific Northwest Conservation Association, and Lucas Davis, who's an economist at the Haas Energy Institute. And they all said, oh yeah, sure, that'll work in the short term. It'll work for a few years, maybe 5 years, but that's not a very good long-term strategy at all. And there are a number of reasons. One is, first of all, California is adding a lot of battery storage so that they don't have to curtail their solar production. Secondly, they're looking at other projects that will use cheap solar, which like the hydrogen, the big, I think it's called High Deal LA. I did an interview with Forest BC, which is involved in it. So they're looking at taking that cheap solar, turning it into hydrogen, and then using it as fuel in their existing natural gas power plants around LA. And then thirdly, transmission issues. There are all sorts of transmission congestion, apparently, in California, and those are difficult to resolve because the NIMBYism and long regulatory processes and so on. So the message very clearly from those three American experts was good short-term policy, could work just fine, bad, medium, and long-term policy. And maybe I'll just throw it open to the three panelists if you want to add anything or to those comments.
The only thing I would add is that, I don't think you'd find too many electricity planners who on a long-term basis believe that spot market opportunities that you don't control represent a sound planning basis. And so when you combine that with those comments, Dan's comments that, a surplus in a high electrification environment can disappear very quickly, and there are very long lead times to adding new electricity, raise a lot of very serious planning concerns. And these aren't speculative concerns. If we want to imagine what happens when bad policy confronts an electric system, we just have to look to the California electricity crisis and other things where policy mistakes were made that had very tangible and real implications for the ability of the system to serve. So it's very comforting to look and see $30 prices and say, and a big pool of electricity and say, I'm going to plan on that basis. But if you don't have your hand on the lever, I'm not sure how many electricity planners are going to be very comfortable with that as the power system that's powering their schools and hospitals and other things that are very important.
Dan or Tom Pierre?
I think, just to summarize that, I think we need to be careful not to seek out short-term gain if it risks long-term pain. And I think that in all likelihood, both in terms of whether in fact there is the access to those electrons in the future, coupled with the fact that if we send the wrong signal to markets in terms of being a stable, attractive place to invest, then in the future when we would really need that investment to come back, we would find that that would likely be very challenging.
And yet, I think to some extent, this is a bit of a red herring conversation because the RP does not include a lot of import. Like right now, I think we all agree, and Cam, I totally agree with you. And I think that's also what we're seeing BC Hydro doing. Like they're not planning to import from California in the long term. It's a stopgap measure in some of the contingency scenarios. I still think it's worth to revisit. One of the things that is concerned to me, obviously the timeline to bring project online, we need to think about it. And I hope that in the short-term action, we're going to see some of this in the RP, which is if indeed we're in the acceleration scenario, A, we need to start investing a lot more in DSM right now. And B, we need to start, we're going to need more supply. How do we start to rebuild that capacity and those relationships? There's been a lot of exodus of IPP brain power from within BC, given the absence of opportunity. So we need to rebuild this. CleanBC is going to be key in this. And so we need to start to see some of those signals in the short-term action of the draft RIP. But I think we're not in a situation right now where hydro is just banking on a whole bunch of export in the long term, import in the long term.
Right, and they aren't as it relates to the draft IRP, and they've drafted that IRP knowing that right now we still do have a self-sufficiency requirement. But I think this is where we have a lack of clarity from government, because in the summer of 2019, no, summer of 2020, where they introduced a bill that would eliminate the self-sufficiency requirement. That hasn't come back. They introduced that bill. It didn't pass prior to the election. That bill hasn't come back. But certainly at the time, they were putting that forward as how they wanted to proceed. And right now, they haven't signaled whether they intend to resurrect that or not. I think one of the reasons why it ended up getting jammed up is that First Nations, quite rightly, flagged that they hadn't been adequately consulted on it, and they certainly, as I've said earlier, many of them have an interest in supplying electricity in the province. So I don't think it's necessarily a red herring, just given the lack of clarity from government as to whether or not that's something that they intend to pursue, and which then BC Hydro would likely, or well, almost certainly would consider.
Yeah, and I think, you know, it's not unreasonable that people are, as Dan suggests, slightly confused, because if there is a large surplus in this province, as they're asserting, and this isn't the long-term plan, and you don't rely on it, British Columbians have been very content with the sort of time-shifting use of the flexible hydro system basis of trade. It's the long-term reliance on non-local power that is precluded by the self-sufficiency requirements. And so I think people are quite reasonably having difficulty understanding why the government is promoting the access to cheap markets and proclaiming a surplus and saying it's not a long-term solution. I, for one, have trouble reconciling that, and I'm sure others do as well.
Great. Well, if those are all the comments, thank you very much for attending our webinar, and we'll wrap it up now. Thank you very much to our panelists, Cam Lustig and Tom Pierre Frappe. I'm not even going to try your last name, Tom Pierre. I apologize. Dan Vinelovich and Lorene, thank you very much for hosting this.
Thanks very much for joining us. We really appreciate it. That was a very engaging and informative conversation. We will post this on our website, and you can then see it anytime. And of course, if you have any questions, we're happy to continue to facilitate getting answers to them. So thanks to Markham and Cam, Tom, and Dan for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Lorraine. Thanks, Markham.